first thing Amos Kane noticed wasn't the women, but the silence. It was dawn in Dust Hollow, a time usually filled with the dry rustle of sagebrush, the irritable chirp of awakening crickets, and the low, mournful sigh of the wind across the endless ochre plains. This morning it was dead. Utterly, unnervingly dead. Amos, standing in the skeletal shadow of his barn, a rusted bucket hanging forgotten from his calloused hand, felt the unnatural hush prickle the sweat on the back of his neck. He turned, his gaze sweeping past the crooked fence posts and the sun-bleached bones of his failed corn patch, towards the eastern gate, the one with the hinge perpetually screaming for oil he couldn't afford. And there, haloed by the rising sun bleeding crimson onto the hardpan, knelt 5 figures. 5 women, kneeling in the dust of his dying ranch, as if praying at an altar of despair. Amos didn't move. He barely breathed. Years of solitude etched into the deep lines around his eyes and the permanent stoop of his shoulders had honed his wariness into a sixth sense. Dust Hollow hadn't been kind. It was a place where hope shriveled faster than crops under the relentless Arizona sun, a forgotten corner where the only visitors were dust devils and disappointment. His own story was written in the sagging porch of the clapboard house, the barn missing half its shingles like rotten teeth, and the empty corral where no horse had whinnied in 3 long years. Only Bess, his ancient sway-backed mare, remained, a silent companion in this slow surrender to the elements. He was 38, but felt twice that, haunted not by ghosts, but by absences. The laughter that never echoed in the empty rooms, the weight of dreams that had turned to dust like everything else in this god-forsaken place. He'd come here a younger man, fueled by visions of green pastures, and a family name carved into the land. The land, unforgiving and vast, had carved into him instead, leaving him hard, skeptical, and achingly alone. Compassion wasn't dead in him, but it was buried deep, layered over with the grit of constant struggle. He survived. That was the sum of Amos Kane's existence. And now, this, 5 women. Their dresses, once perhaps bright calico or sturdy linsey woolsey, were travel-stained and torn, faded to the color of the earth they knelt upon. Dust powdered their hair, their faces pale ovals etched with exhaustion beneath the grime. They didn't speak, they didn't look up, they simply knelt, heads bowed slightly, hands resting on their thighs or clasped loosely in their laps. The unnatural silence pressed down, heavier than the coming heat. Amos finally took a step forward, the crunch of gravel under his worn boot unnaturally loud. The sound seemed to ripple through the kneeling figures. The one in the center, a woman with hair the deep, tangled brown of river mud and eyes that held a fierce, weary intelligence, lifted her head first. Her gaze met Amos's, not pleading, but steady, assessing. Layla. The name came to him unbidden, solid as stone. Beside her, a slighter figure with hair like spun sunlight escaping its braid, flinched at Amos's approach. Rose. Her eyes were wide, dreamy, fixed on a hawk circling high overhead, as if it held a message only she could decipher. To Lila's right knelt a woman whose posture spoke of contained strength, her hands rough and capable even in repose. Esther. Her gaze flickered over Amos's worn tools leaning against the barn, a practical inventory. On the far left, a woman with dark, watchful eyes and a stillness that felt profound observed Amos with unnerving intensity. Clara. She noted the broken gate hinge, the parched trough, the sheer exhaustion in Amos's stance. Finally, tucked almost behind Lila, was the youngest, her face still holding the softness of girlhood beneath the dust and fear. May. She clutched a small, frayed cloth bundle to her chest like a shield, her knuckles white. Who are you? Amos's voice rasped, unused to addressing anyone but Bess or the stubborn earth. It scraped the silence like a rusty hinge. What do you want here? Lila didn't flinch. Sanctuary, Mr. Kane. Her voice was low, hoarse from dust or disuse, but clear. It wasn't a plea, it was a statement, weighted with an unspoken history. Just sanctuary. For a night, sanctuary. The word hung in the dead air, absurdly large in the context of his crumbling domain. Sanctuary, from what? The vast empty plains behind them offered no clues. No wagon, no horses, just these 5 figures and the immense indifferent sky. Their arrival felt less like travel, and more like emergence, as if the desert itself had coughed them up onto his threshold. Amos's gaze swept over them again. He saw the raw blisters on Esther's palms, the way Rose's shoulder trembled slightly despite her fixed gaze on the sky, the protective curve of Lila's arm near May, the unsettling depth of Clara's observation. They weren't sisters. The differences were too stark, in bearing, in the shadows behind their eyes. Yet, they were bound together by something thicker than blood, something forged in desperation. Fleeing, always the fleeing out here. Men from the law, families from debt, dreams from reality. What nightmare chased them? His instinct screamed caution. Sanctuary meant responsibility. It meant sharing his meager stores of water and hardtack, inviting the unknown into the fragile, isolated world he'd built, stone by stone, failure by failure. It meant risk. Dust Hollow's silence was safer than its whispers. He took another step closer, the dust puffing around his boots. The sun cleared the distant ridge, bathing the kneeling women and his dilapidated ranch in harsh, revealing light. It illuminated the stark lines of hunger on their faces, the frayed hems of their dresses, the utter vulnerability of their posture, and something else. A faint, dark smudge on the dusty hem of Esther's skirt, not mud. It looked like dried blood. Before Amos could process it, before he could form another question, May whimpered. It was a small, choked sound, quickly stifled, but it made Clara's head snap towards the eastern horizon, her dark eyes narrowing with sudden sharp fear. Lila's hand tightened imperceptibly on her knee. Amos followed Clara's gaze. Beyond the kneeling women, beyond the broken gate, the land stretched empty and vast under the climbing sun. Yet, a faint, rhythmic tremor began to vibrate through the hardpan beneath his feet. Distant, but unmistakable. Not the wind, not coyotes, the sound of hoofbeats, many hoofbeats, drumming a steady, ominous rhythm out of the shimmering heat haze, growing steadily louder, coming fast, coming here. The silence was utterly shattered. Amos Kane stood frozen, the rusted bucket, slipping from his numb fingers to clatter loudly on the stones, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Sanctuary asked for, danger arriving, and 5 pairs of eyes, wide with a dawning terror he didn't yet understand, locked onto his. The hoofbeats thundered closer, a relentless pulse against the fragile stillness of the morning. Who rode with such purpose towards his forgotten corner of hell? The hoofbeats weren't thunder, not yet. They were the insistent drumming of a warhorse's heart, amplified 100-fold, vibrating up through Amos's worn boot soles and into the marrow of his bones. It shattered the fragile, kneeling silence, replacing it with a raw, physical dread that choked the dry air. 5 pairs of eyes, wide with a terror Amos couldn't fathom but instinctively recognized, locked onto his. Lila's fierce intelligence had hardened into flint. Rose flinched, her gaze snapping down from the hawk, as if it had turned predatory. Esther's capable hands clenched into fists. Clara's watchfulness became a hunted animal's stillness. May buried her face against Lila's side, a muffled sob escaping. Amos acted before thought. Years of solitude hadn't erased the reflexes honed by frontier uncertainty. He lunged, not towards the rifle leaning uselessly against the barn wall 10 paces away, but towards the women. "Get up!" His voice rough as sandstone cut through the rising din. Inside, now, he gestured wildly towards the sagging porch of the clapboard house, its door hanging slightly ajar like a slack jaw. Lila moved first, hauling May upright with surprising strength. "Move!" she echoed, her command sharp, propelling the younger girl forward. Esther was already scrambling, her practical mind assessing the distance to the dubious safety of the house. Rose seemed dazed, stumbling until Clara's firm hand gripped her elbow, pulling her along with silent urgency. Amos herded them, a gaunt, dust-streaked shepherd, driving frightened lambs towards a crumbling fold. He saw the dark smudge on Esther's skirt again as she ran, dried blood unmistakable now against the faded fabric. He slammed the warped door shut behind them, just as the riders crested the low rise near the broken gate. The thunder coalesced into distinct shapes, 6 men on lathered horses, their silhouettes stark and menacing against the blinding morning sun. Dust plumed around them, a dirty halo. They reined in sharply, horses stamping and blowing, just beyond the screaming hinge gate. Amos peered through a crack in the door's weathered wood, his own breath ragged. The women huddled in the dim, stale interior, pressed against the far wall where a single cracked lantern hung, unlit, symbol of countless dark, solitary nights. The smell of dust, old wood, and sudden collective fear filled the cramped space. The lead rider, a broad-shouldered man with a hat pulled low, scanned the dilapidated ranch with visible contempt. His gaze lingered on the empty corral, the barn's skeletal roof, then settled on the house. Amos could feel the weight of that look even through the wood. Another rider, leaner, with a scar carving a pale line through his stubble, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto Amos's hardpan. "Place looks deader than last week's possum, Cade," he drawled. Cade, the leader, ignored him. He nudged his horse a step closer to the gate. "Kane," his voice was a whip crack, loud in the sudden quiet after the hoofbeats ceased. "Amos Kane, show yourself." Inside, May whimpered again, a sound like a trapped bird. Lila wrapped an arm tighter around her, her own face pale but set. Esther's eyes darted around the room, landing on Amos's meager stack of firewood, a worn axe leaning beside it. Clara stood slightly apart, her intense gaze fixed on the crack in the door Amos used, as if she could see through it. Rose simply stared at the dusty floorboards, her lips moving soundlessly. Amos hesitated. Years of avoiding trouble warred with a sudden fierce urge to protect the fragile sanctuary these desperate women had stumbled into. His ranch was a ruin, but it was his ruin. A memory flickered, unbidden. Laughter echoing in this very room, the smell of fresh bread, a warmth long extinguished. The ache was sudden and sharp. He pushed it down, hardening himself. Compassion was a luxury he couldn't afford, but turning them out now, it felt like kicking a wounded pup. He eased the door open just enough to be seen, stepping onto the porch, deliberately leaving the rifle inside. He squared his shoulders, meeting Cade's cold stare across the yard. "What do you want?" Amos called, his voice deliberately flat, betraying nothing. Cade's lips twisted into a humorless approximation of a smile. "Just passin' through, Kane. Lookin' for something that belongs to someone else." His eyes, shadowed beneath the hat brim, scanned the porch, the windows, missing nothing. "5-somethings matter of fact. Seen 'em. Travelin' light, likely lookin' worse for wear." The lie was as thin as the dust in the air. Amos felt the women's collective intake of breath behind him, a silent gasp. He kept his face impassive, the weathered mask of a man used to disappointment. "Nothin' passes through here 'cept dust and wind," Amos replied, gesturing vaguely at the desolation surrounding them. "Ain't seen hide nor hair of anyone for weeks. Place eats hope, not visitors." He hoped the bitterness in his voice sounded convincing. The scarred rider chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Told ya, Cade, waste of time. This ain't nothin' but a graveyard for dreams." Cade didn't look convinced. His gaze swept the yard again, lingering on the disturbed dust near the gate where the women had knelt. Then it lifted, past Amos to the roof of the barn. Amos followed his look. Perched on the highest remaining ridgepole, silhouetted against the hard blue sky, sat a lone hawk, watching, waiting. "Maybe," Cade said slowly, his voice dropping, becoming more dangerous. "But graveyards sometimes hide things people want buried." He leaned forward slightly in his saddle. "You sure you ain't seen nothin', Kane?" "Nothin' lost. Things have a way of turning up where they ain't wanted. Can cause trouble for a man keepin' to himself." The threat hung in the air, thick as the dust stirred by their horses. Amos felt a cold sweat prickle his spine. He saw Esther through the crack in the door he hadn't fully closed, silently pick up the worn axe handle, her knuckles white on the wood, a gesture of defiance, or desperation. Before Amos could formulate a response, Cade straightened. "We'll be riding on, for now." He tugged his hat brim lower. "But we got business in Dust Hollow. Folks there, they talk. They know what's owed. Might be they'll have more to say." He wheeled his horse with a sharp command. The others followed, kicking up fresh clouds of ochre dust as they trotted back the way they came, leaving the ominous echo of their passage hanging over the ranch. Amos watched the dust cloud recede, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped thing. The hawk launched itself from the barn roof with a piercing cry, soaring into the vast emptiness. Inside, the women remained frozen. The silence returned, heavier now, laden with unspoken terror and Cade's parting words. Folks there, they talk. They know what's owed. As Amos turned slowly back to the house, his gaze fell not on the frightened women, but on the dry well near the corner of the porch. A rusted iron bell, cracked and long silent, hung above it, a relic from better days, meant to call hands in from the fields. It hadn't made a sound in a decade, but looking at it now, Amos felt a chilling certainty. Dust Hollow hadn't forgotten him, and its silence was about to break. He pushed the door open wider, his eyes meeting Lila's. Her gaze held the question he couldn't answer. The question that echoed in the suffocating quiet, what now? And beneath it, another, more terrifying thought sparked by Esther's white-knuckled grip on the axe handle and the dark stain on her skirt. What have you brought to my door? The silence after the rider's dust settled felt thicker than the Arizona heat, heavy with Cade's unspoken threats and the cracked bell's mute accusation. Amos stood frozen on the porch, the image of Esther's white-knuckled grip on the axe handle and the dark stain on her skirt burning behind his eyes. What have you brought to my door? The question echoed in the hollow space where his solitude used to reside. Inside, the women remained statues carved from fear and exhaustion. May's muffled sobs were the only sound. Slowly, Lila uncurled her arm from the girl. Her voice, when it came, was low, stripped bare. We'll go. Before dark. We shouldn't have. Go where? Amos's voice rasped, startling even himself. He turned from the empty horizon, the receding dust cloud a taunt. His gaze swept the huddled figures in his dim, dusty parlor, a space that hadn't held this much life, or this much dread in a decade. Cade's right about one thing. Dust Hollow talks. And they'll be watching every trail out of here now. The thought of them stumbling back into that vast, merciless emptiness, hunted, felt like kicking Bess when she was down. An old memory surfaced, sharp as cactus spines, a woman's hand resting on this very porch railing. Her voice soft, even broken things need shelter sometimes. He shoved it down, but the ache lingered. Esther stepped forward, her practical gaze sweeping the room. We can work, she stated, her voice firm despite the tremor beneath. For the roof over our heads tonight, we can mend, clean. She gestured towards the grime-coated window, the sagging shelves layered with years of neglect. This place, it has bones. Good bones. Her eyes met Amos's, a challenge and an offer in one. Amos saw the desperation beneath her practicality, the raw blisters on her palms. He saw Lila's fierce pride warring with necessity, Rose staring vacantly at a sunbeam cutting through the dust motes, Clara's unnerving watchfulness now fixed on the door, and May trembling like a leaf. Sanctuary wasn't a gift, it was a pact forged in shared vulnerability. He gave a curt nod, the only agreement he could muster. Water's in the barrel out back. Rags somewhere. The next hours unfolded with a quiet intensity. Amos, moving with the ingrained habits of solitude, fetched water and pointed out the few serviceable tools. He watched, a wary observer in his own crumbling world, as the women began the impossible task of imposing order on decay. Esther attacked the layers of grime inside with fierce efficiency, her movements economical and strong. Lila organized, directing May to gather loose debris, her voice low but steady. Rose, surprisingly, found a broom with most of its bristles and swept the porch with a dreamy, distracted rhythm, her gaze often drifting towards the distant hills as if seeking answers only she could see. Clara was different. She didn't join the cleaning frenzy immediately. Instead, she moved through the main room like a shadow, her intense eyes cataloging everything. The empty hooks where pictures might have hung, the cold hearth, the deep scratches on the worn floorboards near the door. She paused by the cold stove, her fingers brushing a patch of rust, a frown etching her brow. Then, her hand went to her throat, hidden beneath the high collar of her worn dress. Amos caught the faint glint of metal as she pulled out a small tarnished silver locket on a thin chain. She didn't open it. She simply held it, her thumb rubbing the smooth surface with a gesture that spoke of deep habit and profound sorrow. For a fleeting second, the watchful intensity in her eyes softened into something unbearably sad before she tucked the locket away and silently picked up a rag, joining Esther at the window. That small, private moment, the locket, the grief, was a cipher. Amos couldn't decipher, a tiny window into a past shrouded in darkness. Amos found himself drawn outside, the weight of the women's presence inside feeling suddenly immense. He headed towards the skeletal corral, intending to check on Bess, but stopped short. May was there, struggling with a section of the broken fence. A splintered post leaned precariously, tangled in rusty wire. She was trying, with small ineffectual tugs, to straighten it, her face pinched with effort and frustration. Tears streaked clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. He watched her for a moment, the echo of Cade's threat still ringing in his ears. Folks there, they talk. Dust Hollow's judgment was a tangible thing, a pressure building against the fragile walls of his isolation. Helping them was inviting that judgment in. Yet, seeing May's small determined struggle against the overwhelming brokenness, it resonated with something deep and long buried within him. He walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Need a hand?" His voice was gruff, unfamiliar in its offer. May jumped, whirling around, her eyes wide with residual fear. Seeing it was him, she nodded mutely, wiping her cheek with a dusty sleeve. Amos didn't speak much. He showed her how to brace the post with a rock, how to use the leverage of a sturdy branch he fetched to pull the wire taut. His hands, rough and scarred, worked alongside her smaller, softer ones. It was slow, awkward work, but gradually, the section straightened, standing a little taller against the vast, indifferent sky. May watched his hands, mimicking his movements, a flicker of concentration replacing the fear on her face. A fragile thread of shared purpose stretched between them, thin but real. He was showing her how to twist the wire ends together when he saw it. Near the screening hinge gate, half hidden by a clump of hardy sagebrush, something lay on the hardpan. It wasn't there before the riders came. Amos straightened, a cold prickle tracing his spine. He left May securing the wire, and walked over, his steps slow, deliberate. It was a bundle, rough sacking, tied tightly with coarse twine. Kneeling, Amos could smell it before he touched it, a pungent mix of bitter herbs, something acrid like gunpowder residue, and beneath it all, the faint, unmistakable iron tang of dried blood. Carefully, using the tip of his knife, he nudged the bundle. It was heavy, dense, and tucked partially under the sacking, barely visible, was a small, crudely carved figure, a twisted shape resembling a bird, with broken wings, painted a dull, ominous red. It wasn't a gift, it was an offering, or a warning, placed deliberately, silently, while the women cleaned, and May struggled with the fence. While he was distracted, someone from Dust Hollow had been here, close, watching. The fragile sense of purpose he'd felt mending the fence with May evaporated, replaced by a chilling certainty. Cade's words weren't just bluster. The town wasn't just talking, it was acting. The cracked bell above the dry well seemed to mock him in the afternoon silence. Sanctuary was crumbling faster than his roof. He picked up the foul bundle, its weight a terrible promise in his hands. Who left this? What did the broken-winged bird signify? And what darkness exactly had followed these women out of the desert, and onto his doomed piece of earth? The questions hung, poisonous and unanswered, as the wind sighed through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of threat and something ancient, deeply wrong. The foul bundle lay heavy in Amos's hands, the stench of bitter herbs, gunpowder, and old blood clinging to the air like a curse. The crude, red-painted bird with its broken wings seemed to pulse with malevolent intent against the rough sacking. This wasn't just Dust Hollow talking. This was a declaration. Sanctuary wasn't just fragile, it was under siege. He carried the abomination back towards the house, his steps measured, the weight of it a counterpoint to the fragile hope he'd felt mending the fence with May. Inside, the air was different. Dust still danced in the slanted afternoon light, but less of it. Esther had attacked the grime with relentless vigor, revealing faded floral patterns on the wallpaper Amos had forgotten existed. Lila was meticulously organizing salvaged tins on a newly scrubbed shelf. Rose sat on the swept floorboards, humming a tuneless fragment under her breath, weaving strands of dried grass into a small, intricate shape. Clara, ever watchful, stood by the window Esther had cleaned, her gaze scanning the horizon. May hovered near Lila, her eyes wide and anxious. All activity ceased when Amos entered. The bundle held away from his body. The pungent odor immediately filled the small space, overpowering the scent of soap and damp rags. Lila's hand froze mid-air. Esther set down her cloth, her face hardening. Rose's humming stopped abruptly, her fingers crushing the half-formed grass shape. Clara turned from the window, her intense eyes locking onto the sacking, then flicking to Amos's face. May shrank back. What is that?" May whispered, her voice trembling. Amos didn't answer directly. He crossed to the cold stove, the only place that felt remotely appropriate, and set the bundle down with deliberate care. "Found it near the gate," he said, his voice gravelly. "Wasn't there before." Lila moved first. She approached the stove, her movements controlled but radiating a fierce tension. She didn't touch the bundle but leaned close, her nostrils flaring as she inhaled the foul miasma. Her expression didn't change, but Amos saw a flicker of profound recognition, a hardening of her jaw that spoke of intimate, terrible knowledge. "The Red Hawk," she murmured, the name dropping into the silence like a stone. "They mark what they claim." She didn't elaborate, didn't look at the others. The simple statement hung, laden with unspoken horror, deepening the mystery instead of solving it. Esther swore under her breath, a low, guttural sound. She strode to the door, peering out through the crack, her posture rigid. "Planted while we were busy." Her voice was tight with anger and fear. "They were watching." Clara finally spoke, her voice low and surprisingly calm, yet carrying an edge like honed steel. "We need to see." She gestured towards the bundle. "What else is inside?" Amos hesitated. Unwrapping it felt like inviting the curse deeper. But Clara's logic was undeniable. Using his knife again, he carefully cut the coarse twine. The sacking fell open, revealing not the gore Amos half expected, but tightly packed, dried, dark purple flowers with jagged petals, pungent gray-green leaves, and dark pebble-like objects that smelled acrid. Nestled within the noxious vegetation lay a small stained leather pouch, cinched shut, and beneath it all, staining the sacking, was the dark crusted patch of blood. "Devil's claw," Rose said suddenly, her voice distant, dreamy, yet oddly certain. She hadn't moved from the floor. "For binding. And crow's eye berries. Poison." She pointed a slender finger at the dark pebbles. "Old magic. Bad medicine." Her knowledge, surfacing from her detached state, was another unexpected shard of a past they couldn't see. She offered no explanation, simply stating facts as if reading them from the dust motes. The revelation sent a fresh chill through the room. Poison, dark magic. This was beyond simple malice. It was ritualistic threat. Amos picked up the small leather pouch. It was heavy for its size. He loosened the drawstring and tilted it. 3 dull, unmarked lead slugs tumbled onto the stove's cold iron surface with soft thuds. Not bullets for a gun, but crude weights. Symbols. A final chilling punctuation. "They mean to bury us here," Esther stated flatly, turning from the door. Her practical mind saw the grim equation, the binding herbs, the poison, the blood, the weights. A curse for the land and its inhabitants. A shared resolve solidified in the dusty air. Fear remained, thick and cloying, but it was met now by a burgeoning defiance. They wouldn't be buried without a fight. "Bar the door properly," Lila commanded, her voice regaining its steel. "Check the shutters. Anything loose, nail it tight." She looked at Amos. "Do you have anything?" "Anything at all." He thought of the old rifle, its mechanism stiff with disuse, the scant handful of cartridges tucked away in a tin. "Little," he admitted. "But it's something." Work began anew, charged with grim purpose. Esther and Clara dragged the heavy oak table to brace the door. May, under Lila's direction, gathered every loose nail she could find. Amos retrieved the rifle and the tin of cartridges, the cold weight of the metal foreign yet grounding in his hands. He watched Rose, still seated, her dreamy detachment momentarily replaced by a focused intensity as she carefully gathered the poisonous berries onto a scrap of cloth, handling them with surprising expertise before hiding them deep in a pocket. Another hidden facet. He found himself working alongside Esther to secure a loose shutter on the west window. Her strength was impressive, holding the warped wood in place while he hammered. Their hands brushed rough and calloused, a shared effort against the encroaching darkness. "Used to help my path shore up the barn before storms," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Never figured I'd be doing it to keep men out." It was the first personal fragment she'd offered, hinting at a life violently interrupted. As dusk painted the plains in shades of violet and gold, casting long distorted shadows from the mended fence posts, a lone figure appeared on the trail from Dust Hollow. Not Cade, not a rider, an old man, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick, his pace slow but deliberate. Amos recognized Jedediah Pettigrew, the town's ancient storekeeper, a man known more for his silence than his speech. Amos met him at the gate, rifle held loosely but visibly at his side. Pettigrew stopped a few paces away, his rheumy eyes taking in the subtly altered ranch, the swept porch, the secured shutter, the straightened section of fence where May had worked. His gaze lingered on Amos's rifle. "Amos," Pettigrew rasped, his voice like dry leaves. "Folks are talking." "Folks always talk, Jed," Amos replied, his voice flat. "Talk carries weight out here," Pettigrew countered, his eyes flicking towards the house. "Heavy weight, unnatural things been brewin', bad blood stirrin'." He shifted his weight on the stick. "Cade, he ain't a patient man, nor a forgiven one. What's owed, gets collected." He paused, letting the threat settle. "Some say you got something don't belong to you. Something that brings trouble. Dust Hollow don't like trouble blowin' in." Amos felt the eyes of the women on him from the darkened windows. "Nothin' here that ain't mine to keep or let go, Jed. Trouble finds its own way." Pettigrew sighed, a long wheezing sound. "Just bringin' words, Amos. Friendly warnin', the kind you heed. That bundle you found, consider it an invitation to choose sides." He turned slowly, painfully, to shuffle back towards town. "Sun sets fast these days," he called over his shoulder, the words carrying an ominous finality. "Be dark soon." Amos watched the old man's retreating silhouette merge with the gathering twilight. Pettigrew's words weren't friendly. They were the velvet glove over Dust Hollow's iron fist. An ultimatum. He turned back towards the house, the weight of the rifle suddenly heavier. As he approached the porch steps, his boot scuffed against something half buried in the dust. Not a bundle this time, a single crude carving, the same red-painted bird with broken wings, freshly made. Left while Pettigrew talked, while Amos's attention was diverted. Someone had been right here. Close enough to touch. Close enough to strike. The second bird lay at his feet, a silent scream in the fading light. The message was clear. "We are here. We are watching. Your time is running out." The fragile curtain of sanctuary Esther had hung over the newly cleaned window fluttered in the evening breeze, a thin veil against the encroaching night and the unseen eyes beyond. Moonlight spilled over Dust Hollow, cold and sharp, turning the ranch into a fortress of shadow and defiance. Amos Kane stood on the porch, the second red-painted bird with broken wings clutched in his hand, its crude form a silent scream against the night. The cracked bell above the dry well gleamed faintly, a relic of lost days now heavy with the weight of Dust Hollow's ultimatum. The air carried the scent of sagebrush and gunpowder, a promise of what was coming. Cade's men would ride at moonrise. The ranch, patched and fortified by desperate hands, stood ready, or as ready as it could be. Inside, the women were a quiet storm. Lila, her river mud hair tied tight, checked the boarded windows, her movements precise, her eyes burning with resolve. Esther, scar bared on her forearm, leaned against the barricaded door, hammer in hand, her strength a bulwark. Rose sat by the cold hearth, her fingers tracing the tattered quilt's stitches, humming a hymn that felt like a shield. May, no longer trembling, stacked salvage nails near the rifle, her small hands steady with newfound courage. Clara stood apart, her silver locket glinting as she whispered to herself, her watchful gaze softer now, as if speaking to someone long gone. Amos stepped inside, the bird carving hidden in his pocket, Its weight was a reminder of the curse, or warning that stalked them. He met Lila's gaze. "They're coming," he said, voice low, rough as the dry creek bed beyond the corral. "Cade, his men, tonight." Lila nodded, no surprise in her eyes. "We knew they would." She turned to the others. "We stand, no running." Her voice was iron, forged in fires Amos couldn't imagine. The women nodded, a silent pact woven through shared glances. Clara spoke, her voice steady but heavy. "I ran once, left someone behind." Her fingers brushed the locket, a confession breaking free. "My brother, he told me to go, said he'd hold the door." I hear his voice still. She didn't open the locket, didn't need to. The grief in her eyes was a story told in silence, a final shard of her past offered like a vow to stay. Amos felt the weight of it, a mirror to his own ghosts, his mother's journal, her voice calling him home, now dust. They worked in the dim glow of a single lantern, its cracked glass casting jagged shadows. Amos loaded the rifle, its stiff mechanisms protesting but yielding. Esther and Lila reinforced the door with a warped plank. Rose tied her grass-woven shape, a small intricate star to the quilt, a quiet talisman. May, under Clara's guidance, wedged a chair against a loose shutter. The ranch, once a ruin, breathed with their defiance, its mended fence and cleaned windows a testament to their claim. Hoofbeats broke the night, a low thunder rolling closer. Amos stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, the women behind him. 6 riders emerged from the dark, Cade at their lead, his hat low, torchlight glinting on his cold eyes. The scarred rider spat, his horse stamping. Dust swirled like a shroud. Cade's voice was a whip crack. "Send him out, this ain't your fight." Amos stood firm, the porch creaking beneath him. "My land, my fight." His voice was steady, a man no longer alone. Lila stepped beside him, her chin high. Esther's hammer gleamed. Clara's hand rested on her locket, calm as stone. Rose hummed softly, May clutching her sleeve. Cade's eyes narrowed, torchlight flaring. "You choose wrong, Kane." He raised a hand, signaling his men. A torch arced toward the barn, but Esther lunged, knocking it into the dust with her hammer, sparks scattering like stars. "Enough." Lila's voice cut through the night, fierce and unafraid. "We're done being claimed." She stepped forward, unarmed, her presence a challenge. Cade hesitated, his men shifting, unnerved by her fire. A sharp clang shattered the standoff. The cracked bell above the well rang once, struck by a gust of wind, its voice raw but clear. It was no miracle, just chance, but it felt like a call. Amos raised the rifle, firing a single shot into the sky. The crack echoed across the plains, a line drawn. Cade's men flinched, horses rearing. He glared, but something in the women's united stance, in Amos's unyielding gaze, broke his resolve. "This ain't over," he snarled, wheeling his horse. His men followed, torches fading into the dark, their hoofbeats a retreating storm. Dawn crept over the ranch, soft and bruised. The bell hung silent again, but the quilt draped over the porch rail stirred in the breeze, its star-shaped talisman catching the light. Amos stood with the women, the rifle at rest. Dust Hollow's judgment lingered on the horizon, a shadow not banished but held at bay. Clara tucked her locket away, a quiet peace in her eyes. Lila's hand brushed May's shoulder. Esther nodded to Amos, and Rose smiled, her hymn lingering. The ranch stood, scarred but alive. They'd claimed it, not with blood, but with defiance, a fragile home under an uncertain sky. What came next, Dust Hollow's wrath, the women's pasts, remained unwritten, but for now, the gate held, and the sagebrush bloomed.